"Hey, old man," Tommy had said with a smirk, "could one salute change everything? Try not to break a hip." "All right." The words echoed in the quiet halls of the high school. Sharp and careless, Jack Turner didn't reply, he just kept working. Quiet and patient, no one knew who he really was, no one cared about the man who swept the floors and fixed the doors, not until Veterans Day came and the colonel raised his hand in a salute that silenced every voice in the room. Some heroes never asked to be remembered, but in that single moment, they're seen and they're never forgotten. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning air in Brooksville carried a bite that seemed to settle in the bones. It was the kind of cold that made every breath feel sharper, each step more deliberate. The sun was just beginning to rise above the tree line, its soft glow brushing the brick walls of Brooksville High School 15 miles away. The gates of Fort Liberty stood in silent tribute to the thousands who had served. The small town of Brooksville had always felt the echo of that military heartbeat, fathers, sons, and neighbors who wore the uniform with quiet pride. Inside the school, final preparations were underway for the Veterans Day assembly. Paper stars in red, white, and blue lined the hallways, taped up by student volunteers the day before. The smell of freshly brewed coffee from the teacher's lounge drifted down the corridors, mixing with the faint tang of floor wax and early morning dust. At the far end of the main hallway, under the soft hum of flickering fluorescent lights, moved a man few paid attention to. Jack Turner, 72 years old, pushed a battered mop bucket down the length of the tiled floor. His back was straight, though age had begun to stiffen his shoulders. His silver hair was trimmed neat and close, a habit from another life. His uniform was the plain blue of a school custodian, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, showing forearms still strong despite the years. Jack worked in quiet rhythm. He wiped down smudged windows, adjusted a crooked poster of the American flag near the entrance, and gathered stray papers left behind by hurried teachers. His steps were careful, deliberate, favoring his left leg just a little. Old injuries had a way of remembering, even when the world didn't. Most of the students paid him no mind to them. He was just the old janitor, always there, always quiet, a part of the background, like the squeak of the intercom or the rattle of the heating pipes. He didn't seem to mind the anonymity. In fact, he wore it like a shield. But not everyone ignored him. A cluster of boys gathered near the trophy case, watched him with thinly veiled amusement. Tommy Parker, a senior with an easy smile that rarely reached his eyes, leaned against the glass, his varsity jacket crisp and new. "Look at old Turner," Tommy said in a low voice that carried down the hall. "Man's been here longer than half these trophies." One of his friends snorted. "Yeah, bet he was here when they built the place." The laughter was sharp, careless, the kind that cut because it was meant to. Jack didn't turn to look at them. He simply dipped the mop back into the bucket, the water dark and swirling, and began the slow, measured strokes across the floor. His face betrayed nothing, no flicker of annoyance, no flash of anger, just the same calm, distant look he always wore. Tommy took a step closer, his sneakers squeaking on the wet tile. "Hey, Mr. Turner," he called, a mock politeness in his tone. "You miss a spot right here." He pointed to an imaginary smear, smirking at his friends. Jack paused, the mop held loosely in his hand. For a moment, he looked at Tommy, just looked. His blue-gray eyes were steady, unreadable, like a calm sea that could hide the deepest currents. Then he gave a small nod as if to humor the boy, and moved the mop a fraction to the left. No argument, no words, just a quiet compliance. Tommy's smirk faded a little, as if the lack of reaction took the fun out of it. He turned back to his friends with a shrug, and they drifted away, their laughter echoing down the hall. Could this quiet man hold a secret? When the last of their footsteps faded, Jack leaned the mop handle against the wall and took a moment to roll his shoulders back, working out the stiffness. His breath left him in a soft sigh, the kind that held more weight than words ever could. He glanced out the window where the sky had shifted from steel gray to the soft gold of a new day. Somewhere in that morning light, he let his thoughts wander just for a heartbeat back to the years when his uniform was a different shade of blue, when he had stood at attention for reasons no one in this hallway would ever know. He didn't linger in those memories. Jack Turner never did. He picked up the mop again and continued down the hall, his steps measured and sure. The quiet was a comfort, and in it he found a kind of peace that had always eluded him in the noise of the world. Down near the main entrance, Lena Williams watched from the doorway of her classroom. Lena was in her late 20s, a history teacher with a soft voice and a sharper mind than most gave her credit for. She noticed Jack in ways others didn't, the careful way he straightened a bent flag pin on the bulletin board, the quiet patience in his hands as he fixed a squeaky door without being asked. She had heard rumors, of course. In towns like Brooksville, stories had a way of drifting down through the years. Like old songs, someone said Jack had served in Vietnam, another claimed he had medals tucked away somewhere. Though he never spoke of them, Lena believed it. There was a gravity to him, a kind of dignity that didn't come from the work he did now, but from something older, deeper. She stepped into the hall as he passed by, offering a small smile. "Morning, Mr. Turner," she said softly. He looked up and for a moment the lines around his eyes softened. "Morning, Miss Williams," he replied, his voice a Low rumbled, warm but restrained. You all set for the assembly today? She asked, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Jack just nodded. Big day, he said simply. She nodded back. It is. They stood like that for a moment, two quiet souls sharing a breath of understanding in the hush of a waking school. Then the bell rang and the halls flooded with students shoulder to shoulder, voices rising in a chorus of chatter and laughter. Jack stepped back, letting the tide of youth wash past him. Lena watched him go, her heart tightening a little at the way he moved, steady, calm, invisible to most, but never to her. As the morning unfolded, final rehearsals took over the main auditorium. The chorus practiced America the Beautiful under the watchful eye of the music teacher. The student council ran through the order of events, checking notes and programs, making sure every flag was perfectly placed. In the back, Jack moved between the folding chairs, adjusting them so each row was straight, each seat ready for the weight of the day. The boys who had mocked him earlier passed by again, this time busy with their own roles in the ceremony. Tommy caught his eye for a moment, but Jack only gave him that same small nod before moving on. No resentment, no bitterness, just the quiet dignity of a man who had learned that some battles were worth fighting, and some were better left alone. Outside in the wind carried the faint echo of the bugle calls from Fort Liberty, a reminder that the world beyond these walls had seen sacrifice far greater than a high school assembly could ever capture. And inside, Jack Turner, the man who swept the floors and fixed the broken hinges, carried that memory in every careful step he took. The veterans would be honored today, flags would wave, hands would clap, and speeches would be made. But Jack didn't need a stage to remember, he didn't need a microphone to know what service meant. He just needed this quiet moment, this small, ordinary morning where he could stand in the stillness and know in his bones that he had done what he could, that he had served, that he still served in his own quiet way. And for Jack Turner, that was enough. Could one man's past rewrite the room's perception? Jack Turner moved through the halls with quiet purpose. He paused to empty the trash cans, carefully tying each bag before replacing it with a fresh one. His steps were slow but sure, and even the clatter of the mop bucket seemed to soften around him. Most people barely noticed. They were too busy rushing between classes, juggling lesson plans and teenage laughter. But Lena Williams did. She always did. She watched him as he worked, her keen eyes catching the way he paused to tighten a loose screw on a door handle, or how he adjusted a crooked plaque near the entrance. It was a small thing, but in that quiet care, she saw the hint of something deeper. Lena had only been teaching at Brooksville High for 2 years, but she already knew the rhythm of the place. She knew how easy it was to overlook a man like Jack Turner, how simple it was to take his silent dedication for granted. One morning, as she was hanging a poster for the Veterans Day assembly in her classroom, she gathered the courage to ask him directly. Mr. Turner, she said, her voice gentle, were you ever in the service? Jack paused, one hand resting on the edge of his mop handle. For a moment, his eyes seemed to drift far away, somewhere beyond the bright hallway and the soft buzz of the overhead lights. He gave her a small smile, just a quick flicker of his lips. Long time ago, he said softly. Then he turned back to his work, leaving her with more questions than answers. Outside the classroom, the boys were already gathering. Tommy and his friends leaned against the lockers, their laughter low and knowing. Look at him, Tommy said, his tone dripping with false sweetness. Hey, old man, don't work too hard, wouldn't want you to break a hip. The words were sharp, designed to sting, but Jack didn't react. He just kept moving, the mop gliding over the floor with the same quiet grace. Tommy's friends laughed, slapping each other on the back. To them, Jack was nothing more than a shadow, a ghost in faded overalls. Lena watched from the doorway, her jaw tightening. She wanted to say something, to tell them to show some respect, but the moment slipped by and Jack was already pushing the bucket farther down the hall, out of sight. As the day of the assembly drew closer, the school buzzed with activity. Students rehearsed lines and practiced songs, flags were hung with care, each star and stripe straight and true. Jack worked around them all, setting out extra chairs in the auditorium, checking the exits for squeaky hinges. Every movement was deliberate, every step measured. It was his way of honoring the day. Even if no one else saw it that way, sometimes when the halls were empty, he would pause near the glass trophy case and rest his hand lightly on the frame. The reflection there, his lined face, the silver hair stared back at him like an old friend. It had been years since he'd worn the uniform, years since he'd stood shoulder to shoulder with men who trusted him with their lives. Now he trusted only the silence. On the morning of the final rehearsal, Lena found him near the stage, adjusting a loose bolt on the folding chairs. She stopped a few steps away, watching the quiet patience in his work. You know, she said carefully, some of the teachers have been talking, they say you might have served in the Marines. Jack didn't look up. He tested the chair, made sure it didn't wobble, then moved to the next. Lot of folks served, he said simply. Lena hesitated. But you never talk about it. He straightened slowly, his gaze meeting hers. For a moment, there was something in his eyes, a flicker Of memory maybe, or sadness too deep to name. Some stories, he said quietly, aren't meant for sharing. Lena nodded. She didn't press further, but as she turned to go, she caught a final glance of his hands, rough, calloused, still steady. Tommy and his friends were there, too, lurking in the wings of the auditorium. They saw the exchange, though they didn't understand it. Trying to chat up the janitor, Miss Williams, Tommy called, his tone mocking. His friends snickered, but Lena just gave them a measured look and walked away. As Jack passed them by, Tommy stuck out a foot, not enough to trip him, but enough to make a point. Jack didn't flinch, he just stepped over the outstretched leg and kept moving. You're wasting your breath, old man, Tommy muttered under his breath. Jack paused at the edge of the stage, his face calm, almost serene. He looked back at Tommy, his voice soft but firm. We all have our work to do, he said, then he turned and kept going. The auditorium grew quiet for a moment after that. Even Tommy didn't have a reply. As the final rehearsal began, the students gathered on stage, their voices blending in tentative harmony. The music teacher fussed over the microphone levels, the principal checked the program one last time. Jack worked along the edges, picking up stray programs, adjusting the folding chairs. He was everywhere and nowhere, moving like a shadow, cleaning up the small messes no one else saw. Lena watched him as she moved through the rows, her hands full of sheet music. She saw the way he paused to help a freshman carry a music stand, the way he made sure every seat was lined up just right. It was in those small gestures that she saw it most clearly, the discipline, the care, the quiet pride. When the students took a break, Tommy leaned back in his chair, his feet propped up on the seat in front of him. Jack passed by, his bucket rattling softly, and Tommy smirked. Big day tomorrow, huh? Tommy said, his voice dripping with insincerity. Maybe you'll finally get your 5 minutes of fame, old man. Jack paused, one hand resting on the mop handle. He looked at Tommy for a long moment and then a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It's not about fame, he said simply, it's about respect. Tommy blinked, caught off guard by the calm certainty in the old man's voice. He opened his mouth to reply, but Jack had already moved on, the mop gliding across the floor in even strokes. In that moment, Tommy didn't know what to say. Could a single salute reveal a hidden hero? The rest of the day passed in a blur of final preparations. Lena stayed late, going over her notes for the assembly. Jack stayed too, wiping down the last of the chairs, his hands steady and sure. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the halls emptied of laughter and noise, Jack Turner stood alone in the quiet. He ran a hand along the back of the last row of chairs, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingers. For him, the Veterans Day assembly wasn't about the speeches or the songs, it was about the small ways people showed up, the small ways they remembered. He had lived a lifetime in the spaces between the noise, in the quiet acts no one else saw, and he would be ready for tomorrow. He always was. The morning of the assembly dawned clear and bright. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the auditorium, casting long rays across the polished floor. Rows of chairs stretched out in perfect order, each one waiting to be filled. Jack Turner stood at the back of the room, his hands resting on the worn handle of his broom, his shoulders squared, his face calm. The whispers of the students as they filed and passed him by like a breeze. Tommy and his friends sat in the front row, their expressions smug. They laughed quietly, nudging each other as they glanced over their shoulders at the old janitor. Tommy's smirk was confident, his gaze steady and unkind. Jack didn't return the look, he kept his eyes on the floor, sweeping up a few stray leaves that had drifted in on the morning wind. To anyone watching, he was just part of the background. The principal stepped onto the stage, his voice carrying through the microphone. He welcomed everyone, thanked the students for their work, and spoke of the day's importance. Lena sat near the aisle, her heart beating fast. She watched Jack from her seat, her mind replaying every moment of quiet dignity she'd seen in him. She hoped today would show others what she already knew. When the principal finished, he nodded to the student council president, a bright-eyed girl named Emily, who took the microphone next. Her voice was clear, her words rehearsed, but sincere. We gather today, she said, to honor the men and women who have served, to remember their sacrifice, and to thank them for the freedoms we too often take for granted. The room fell silent as she spoke, the weight of her words settling over the rows of students and teachers. Jack shifted his broom to the other hand, his eyes steady on the stage. Then Emily's voice dropped lower. And now, it's my honor to introduce our special guest, she said, a man whose service has inspired many, whose courage has saved lives, and whose presence here today reminds us all of what it truly means to serve. She stepped back as the doors at the side of the stage opened. A tall figure appeared, his uniform crisp, the silver eagle insignia on his shoulders gleaming in the light. Colonel Michael Harris walked with a quiet authority, his gaze sweeping the room as he took the stage. The students sat straighter in their seats, the teachers leaned forward, and even Tommy's smirk faltered. The colonel paused at the podium, letting the silence gather. His voice, when he spoke, was low and steady. I stand before you today, he began, not just as a soldier who has seen battlefields in distant lands, but as a man who knows the price of freedom. He paused, his eyes scanning the rows of young faces. Freedom, he Said again, softer now, is not built on speeches or parades, it's built on sacrifice, on men and women who gave everything so that others might live in peace. Tommy shifted in his seat, glancing again at Jack, who still stood at the back of the room. The old man was unmoving, his expression calm, almost resigned. Colonel Harris continued, his voice gaining strength. We honor the names carved in stone, he said, but too often we forget the quiet heroes who walk among us, the ones who came home and kept serving in ways we never see. Lena's breath caught, she knew somehow where this was going. Colonel Harris looked out across the room, his eyes sharp and clear. I came here today, he said, not just to offer thanks, but to remind us all to never forget those who fought quietly without medals or parades, but whose actions saved lives. He paused, and in that pause, the room seemed to still. Then he turned his head, his gaze moving to the back of the auditorium. His eyes found Jack Turner standing there with his broom, his posture straight and unyielding. A slow smile touched the colonel's lips. He stepped back from the podium and raised his hand in a sharp salute, the gesture crisp and full of respect. Staff Sergeant Jack Turner, he said, his voice ringing out clear and unwavering, the man who carried me through a firefight in Vietnam, who dragged me to safety when I couldn't stand, and who never once asked for recognition. The words hung in the air like a bell tolling in the silence. The students' heads turned as one, their eyes following the colonel's gaze to the man at the back of the room. Jack stood still, his hand resting lightly on the handle of his broom. For a moment, his face was unreadable, then his chin lifted just a fraction and his blue-gray eyes met the colonel's across the sea of seats. The quiet in the room deepened as if every breath had been drawn in and held. Tommy's smirk vanished, he sat frozen, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open. Lena felt her throat tighten. She looked at Jack and saw not the janitor who mopped the halls, but the soldier who had once fought for the life of the man on the stage. Could this revelation transform their respect? Colonel Harris dropped his salute and stepped back to the microphone. This man, he said, his voice full of something that was almost reverence, is the reason I'm standing here today. A hush fell over the crowd, thick and absolute. No one moved, no one spoke. Jack's fingers tightened on the broom handle, the only sign that the words had reached him. His shoulders stayed straight, his head high. The colonel looked back at the crowd. I want you all to understand something, he said. Heroism doesn't always wear a uniform, sometimes it wears overalls and carries a mop, but it never stops serving. Lena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She saw Tommy glance down at his lap, his face paled. Slowly, Jack began to move. He stepped forward, each step measured, his limp slight but unhidden. The students parted for him, the hush deepening as he walked. When he reached the front of the room, the colonel stepped down from the stage and met him there. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. Colonel Harris extended his hand and Jack took it, their grip firm and sure. For a long moment, the two men stood there, the old soldier in the crisp uniform and the quiet janitor in his faded work clothes. Then the colonel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small battered metal case. He held it out to Jack, his eyes bright with respect. Jack hesitated, then took it with careful hands. He opened the case and looked down at the bronze star inside. The light caught the metal, glinting for a moment like fire in the dim room. Lena watched as Jack closed the case again and slipped it into his pocket. He nodded once, a silent thank you that said more than words ever could. The applause, when it came, started softly, a single pair of hands clapping, then another, until the room was filled with the sound of it. Jack stood there, the broom still in his hand, his shoulders straight, and for the first time in many years, he let himself smile. He had been seen, he had been remembered. Jack Turner stood at the foot of the stage, the bronze star now resting deep in his pocket. Colonel Harris stepped aside, his head bowed in quiet respect. The applause faded slowly, leaving only the gentle hush of a room holding its breath. For a long moment, Jack didn't move, then he took a single step forward, his limp evident, but unashamed. He climbed the steps to the stage, each movement deliberate, each breath steady. He didn't say a word as he reached the top. Instead, he turned to face the crowd, the students, the teachers, and the young men who had once mocked him. His eyes were calm, his expression soft, but there was a weight there that everyone could feel. The colonel met him with a small, respectful nod. Jack returned it, the faintest smile touching his lips. He didn't need a speech, he didn't need a script, his presence alone was enough. Lena sat in the front row, her hands clasped tight in her lap. She watched every movement, her heart swelling with something close to pride. She had known there was more to him, but seeing it revealed so plainly felt like a gift. Tommy sat rigid, his eyes downcast. His laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by a flush of shame that crept up his neck. He couldn't look at Jack, couldn't meet the gaze of the man he had mocked. As Jack turned to leave the stage, Lena rose quietly and moved to meet him at the edge of the aisle. Her hand found his as he passed, her fingers curling around his weathered palm. Thank you, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, for everything. Jack looked at her, his eyes gentle. He nodded once, a gesture that spoke of understanding, of a kindness too deep for words. Then he released her hand and continued down the aisle. The students parted for him as he walked. The silence that followed him wasn't empty. It was full of respect, of recognition, of something that felt like healing. Tommy's eyes lifted for a moment, just long enough to see the quiet pride in Jack's face, then he dropped his gaze again, his shoulders hunched. The lesson had found him, even if he hadn't asked for it. Lena turned to watch Jack as he moved toward the back of the room. She saw him pause near the door, his hand brushing lightly over the handle of his broom, an old habit, a small comfort, and in that moment, she understood something she hadn't before. Heroism isn't always loud, it isn't always medals and parades. Sometimes it's a man who sweeps the floors and fixes the doors and never asked to be noticed. Sometimes it's the quiet dignity of a life spent in service, first in uniform, and then in the shadows of a place that had nearly forgotten him. Jack didn't stay to bask in the applause. He stepped back into the hallway, the sound of the crowd still echoing softly behind him. The halls he had cleaned for years felt different now, like they really saw him for the first time. He paused at the window that overlooked the small courtyard. The morning sun was higher now, casting long beams across the frost-tipped grass. Jack rested his hand against the glass, feeling the warmth seep through. Outside, the flags of Veterans Day fluttered in the gentle breeze. The red, white, and blue seemed brighter than ever. He closed his eyes for a moment, a quiet breath slipping past his lips. In that stillness, he let himself remember not the battles or the medals, but the men he had fought beside, the ones who never came home. He carried them with him still in every careful step, in every quiet act of kindness. Lena came to stand beside him then, her presence a soft, steady warmth. She didn't say anything, she didn't need to. They stood together, two people who understood that history isn't always written in books or sung in anthems. Sometimes it's carried in the quiet hands of those who never stop serving. Tommy watched from a distance, his face pale, his expression solemn. He had learned something today, something he would carry long after the last echo of applause faded. In the lobby, the teachers spoke in low voices, their eyes flickering toward the doorway where Jack and Lena stood. There was no more laughter, no more careless words, only a deep, abiding respect that would not be forgotten. Jack turned to Lena one last time. "Thank you," he said quietly. His voice was low, steady, like the sound of a river that had run for years. She smiled, tears in her eyes. "No," she said. "Thank you." He gave her that small nod again, then stepped back, his hand brushing the mop handle as he turned to leave. As he disappeared down the hall, the applause in the auditorium rose once more. It was louder this time, fuller, like the town itself had found its voice again. Jack didn't look back. He didn't need to, because in that moment, he wasn't just the janitor, he wasn't just the man who swept the floors, he was the quiet hero who had kept serving long after the war ended. He was the keeper of small spaces, the protector of small kindnesses, and finally, he was seen. When the last echoes of applause faded and the students filed out into the bright November air, the memory of that moment stayed with them, not in the grand speeches or the polished uniforms, but in the quiet man with the silver hair, who had given everything without ever asking for anything in return. And as the doors closed behind him, the town of Brooksville carried that memory forward into every dawn, into every small act of care, because some heroes don't wear medals on their chest, they wear the weight of memory in their hearts, and in the end, that's enough. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition, some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.